Yeah, we're going live now. Good day, chat, wherever you may be in the world, around the world, and welcome to this special stream with my guest Horus and in due course Ataman. And we're going to talk about every fucking time. Sorry, guys, I do that every time. With my guest Horus and in due course Ataman, and we're going to be talking about British foreign policy from the end of the First World War up until about probably the beginning of 1942. If we don't get through it all on this stream, we will do a part 3 if we need to. As always, I'm going to start us off with a bit of a tune.
Safe and sound at home again, let the waters roar, Jack. Safe and sound at home again, let the waters roar, Jack. Long way tossed on the rolling bay, now we're safe ashore, Jack. Don't forget your old shipmate, all the way from Callao, when we sailed from Plymouth Sound, 4 years gone or nigh, Jack. Were there ever chummies now, such as you and I, Jack? Long way tossed on the rolling bay, now we're safe ashore, Jack. Don't forget your old shipmate, all the way from Callao. We have worked the South St. John quarter-deck division, Sponge you and loader I through the whole commission. Long way tossed on the rolling bay, now we're safe ashore, Jack. Don't forget your old shipmate, all the way from Callao. Oftentimes have we laid out, full nor danger fearing, tugging on the flapping sail to the weather bearing. Long way tossed on the rolling bay, now we're safe ashore, Jack. Don't forget your old shipmate, all the way from Callao. When the middle watch was on, and the time went slow, boy, who could choose a rosing stain? Who like Jack or Joe, boy? Long way tossed on the rolling bay, now we're safe ashore, Jack. Don't forget your old shipmate, all the way from Callao. There she swings an empty hull, not a soul below now. Number 7 starboard mess, Mrs. Jack and Joe now. Long way tossed on the rolling bay, now we're safe ashore, Jack. Don't forget your old shipmate, all the way from Callao. What's the best of friends must part, fair or foul the weather. Hand your flipper for a shake, now a drink together. Long way tossed on the rolling bay, now we're safe ashore, Jack. Don't forget your old shipmate, all the way from Callao. Long way tossed on the rolling bay, now we're safe ashore, Jack. Don't forget your old shipmate, all the way from Callao. Hey!
Okay, that was Don't Forget Your Old Shipmates, which is a traditional British sea shanty, and it was sung by Chris Gard. Please go and check out his excellent channel on YouTube. Okay, welcome to my guests. Horus, how are you going, mate?
Good morning to you. Good evening to everyone else. Good to see you again, Ataman. Yeah, thanks for having me back. I really enjoyed last week, and I'm sure we've got plenty to talk about.
Yeah, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, actually. There is, by the way, if anyone wants it, a link to the first stream in the description of this one. So if you want to look at the first stream and you haven't seen it, you can check it out. Look for the link in the description. Adam, how are you going, mate?
I've just got to apologise about the noise here. Sorry, I'm on a road with lots of emergency vehicles going past. I'll try and mute at the right point. All right, sorry.
No worries, mate. No worries. Ataman, how are you going, mate?
Yeah, good. You?
Yeah, not too bad. You weren't really late at all. So, right. Just to bring people up to date, basically, last time we did this stream, we got up to covering the Washington Naval Treaty, but we didn't really get a long way beyond that. The Washington Naval Treaty, in brief form, is basically the Washington Naval Treaty in brief form basically meant that the Royal Navy in the 1920s was reduced to the same size as the US Navy was. And those two navies were the largest in the world, with 15 capital ships each, and similar numbers of cruisers and destroyers and what have you. And then Japan had about 2/3 of the British and American strength, and then after that, Italy and France and what have you were smaller still. And it was designed to stop a naval arms race, which I suppose it did, but it was also a very bad deal from Britain's point of view, because whilst the Americans only had to defend their east and west coast, basically, the British had the whole British Empire to defend. So we really needed more ships. But anyway, Richard Ford in the chat, what was a capital ship? Well, a capital ship these days is usually an aircraft carrier. But back in the 1920s and up to the end of World War II, it was a battleship, a battle cruiser, and originally not an aircraft carrier. I mean, by the end of World War II, they were considered capital ships. But prior to that, they weren't really. So originally, it was a battleship or a battle cruiser. So a ship with at least 12-inch guns and thick armor, basically, that could stand in the line of battle. So the Brits signed this Washington Naval Treaty. Part of the result of that, of course, was one of the things the Americans demanded in order to go ahead with it was that Britain give up her naval alliance with Japan, which had been a good naval alliance for Britain since 1902, so for about 20 years. And the Japanese had always kept their end up of it. In World War I, they joined the war. They even sent warships to the Mediterranean to help the British out. And the Japanese were mortally offended when Britain got rid of it. And of course, the reason the Americans did this was that if Britain and Japan had been in an alliance, they would have still had more ships than the Americans would have. So they didn't like that idea. But many people, including the Australian Prime Minister at the time, who, strange to say, was a Labour Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, did not support getting rid of the Anglo-Japanese naval alliance at all. He thought Britain should have stuck to it, because the Americans weren't willing to become allies of Britain in replacement of that. In fact, they kept up their war plans against the British, which basically involved attacking Canada. They kept up their war plans against the British almost up until World War II, certainly well into the 1930s. So, they weren't exactly a British ally. One of these things, we had a discussion on the Discord earlier in the week about the so-called special relationship. To my mind, it's always been a bit one-sided. It tends to be special when the Brits go running after the Americans and joining their wars, in my opinion. But there we go. On the other hand, when the Brits try and do stuff, the Americans are much more reluctant to do it. And I mean, if you look at Suez in 1956, the Americans acted as our enemy, not our friend. So, and even in the Falklands War, it took Maggie Thatcher to actually be very downright and insist that the Americans choose between Argentina and Britain. And of course, in that example, they actually absolutely had to choose Britain, who was a much more important ally to America than Argentina was. But she really had to push it. So, so there's that. So that's pretty much where we got up to. And one of the people who supported the Washington Naval Treaty was Winston Churchill. Surprise, surprise. At the same time, Britain was trying, because we had now made Japan a potential enemy, The Royal Navy was trying to build a big naval base on Singapore. But Winston Churchill, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, made sure that the Navy never had enough money to properly arm and defend it. Because Winston Churchill was like that. Have either of you two guys got anything to add to that kind of introduction?
Yeah, I could add something that. It seems that he was Chancellor from, was it 24 to 29? I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think, it seems like he acted like a fairly typical politician in that role. Like that, he thought that his spell, he wanted to use that spell as to make himself look prudent and I don't know what the word is. Light on spending in accordance with what he thought Tory voters would approve of, I guess, or middling voters maybe. And so, as in many other spells in his career, I think he just put himself and to some extent his party before the nation. I think there's many instances of that. I think if we come into the 1930s, we'll probably get into that more. But about the relationships between Britain and America as well. I came across this documentary since the last stream that we did called An Ocean Apart. I don't know, have you guys ever heard of this, or people in the chat heard of this?
I've heard of it, but I don't think I've watched it.
So it's really relevant to a lot of what we're talking about. It's David Dimbleby presenting it. I think Adam Curtis, the sort of left-wing guy who later became a documentary maker himself, does some for a leftist very interesting documentaries. Although his last one was awful, but anyway, I think he produced it. And it's from the 80s, and it's about the relationship between America and Britain from the start of the 20th century, I think, up until the 80s. And it covers, it all criticised the relationship largely on sort of cultural grounds or commercial grounds and stuff. But it's quite conventional stuff in most ways. But you might find it interesting anyway. It's just something people might. Just as a food for thought, people might want to watch it. It's called An Ocean Apart. Yeah, BBC. It's on YouTube.
Oh, okay. I'll see if I can find it. Anything you wanted to say, Ataman, on that bit?
No. I made an argument last week about the Washington Naval Treaty, but I'm still not entirely clued up on the specifics. I think there's probably a lot of stuff behind the scenes that we probably will never be savvy to.
It was purely the British government didn't want to get into a naval building race with the Americans, which Britain could just about have afforded in the 1920s.
Yeah, I actually heard someone sum this up, where they said I can't remember the specifics, but they basically said that Britain probably could have afforded it.
Yes.
Like Japan couldn't have afforded it, but wanted to do it. America could have afforded it, but didn't want to do it, build up. And we probably could have afforded it, but it was at a time where we were trying to pay down debts.
Yeah.
And the political will was a little lagging, so we didn't really want to have to do it. But I still think there's probably a lot that went on behind the scenes in that time that we'll never know about.
Well, the Royal Navy, the Royal Navy, were horrified by it.
Yeah.
Because it was basically Britain deliberately handing over control of the seas, which he had kept for well over 100 years by that point.
And Buchanan, brings this up in the book.
He does.
That there were quite a few admirals that were incensed over this and were really quite obstinate about trying to stop it from happening, but it happened anyway.
Yeah, the government was absolutely dead set on getting it. Amongst them, Winston Churchill. And the other thing I was going to say about Winston Churchill during this period was he was one of the main supporters of what was called the 10-year rule, which basically starting in the 1920s, early 1920s. Britain said there will not be a major war for 10 years. The trouble was it was extended every year, so there was never going to be another major war for 10 years. And Churchill kept extending it and supporting extending it, by the way. And of course, what that resulted in was that the Royal Navy and to an even much bigger degree, the British Army and the Royal Air Force were far, far weaker by the end of that time than they had been in 1922.
It's about what Ataman said about the admirals. It makes you wish that some of these admirals were famous authors, like Churchill was, were famous newspaper columnists, because their views, if only their views were still heard now, I think people would have a much more nuanced view of Churchill. There's an excerpt from a letter by Churchill to Stanley Baldwin, who was Prime Minister at the time, in Buchanan's book, isn't there? And he's Churchill just like sort of from any possible angle he can think of, using any pretext he can find, just saying there's no danger of war with Japan. In what possible circumstances could we end up at war with Japan? Well, one where we first sort of slap them in the face and worse people take over because they think that the ones who were allied with us were weaklings.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. Very much so, yeah. I mean, of course, after the Washington Naval Treaty and after Britain abandoned the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty, that was when the military started to take over in Japan.
Yeah, that is a dark turn, obviously, a turn towards a much worse, more horrible world. And obviously, a lot of Chinese and Malaysians and stuff will attest to how disastrous that was for them.
Absolutely.
The line, there's a bit in Buchanan, I should get the quote up really, but there's a bit that struck me in that was a just very succinct line. He says something like, Australia and New Zealand went from being assets to liabilities because of that sort of repudiation of Japan.
Well, we had to defend them. I mean, basically in World War One, and at any time from 1902 up until 1922, Japan had a big fleet in the region that was available to defend Australia and New Zealand. This is why, as I said earlier, that Billy Hughes, for example, the Australian Prime Minister and Labour leader, who was actually a big-time patriot, was very much against getting rid of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance because he knew that it made Australia more vulnerable. And of course, Australia didn't have the population back then to build its own navy up to anything like large enough.
Like again and again, it seems that the leaders of the Dominions took these, had a much more realistic and sort of serious, I don't know, a more sort of global view of things. I mean, they were loyal to Britain.
Oh yeah,
they obviously felt like they were part of the British Empire very, very seriously, and they were serious about the countries that they governed, the Dominions. Because you get it with, was it Mackenzie King? Was that his name? The Canadian Prime Minister? Yeah, and these guys seem to have again and again tried to warn the British government when they were making these blunders. These blunders that, where the price doesn't come due for another 10 or 15 years, but then it comes due very hard, it seems like these guys, like Billy Hughes, Mackenzie King and others, and like some of Jan Smuts and people in South Africa as well.
Africa, yeah.
They kept trying to warn British politicians about the dangers that they were mounting up. I mean, it's not, I'd say none of these things led directly to the Second World War wholesale, but they all made it so much harder to fight and so much more.
They made Britain much weaker.
And had to stretch out so much, right?
Yeah. I mean, also don't forget the navies of Australia and Canada were also counted in the British numbers. So that Australia, which had a battle cruiser in World War One, which was a big ship, faster, as heavily gunned as a battleship, but faster and slightly less armored, HMAS Australia, I should say. That had to be scrapped and sunk because of the Washington Naval Treaty. Because the Americans weren't going to allow the British to turn around and say the Canadians and Australians' navies were not their navy.
It's just horrible.
I mean, and admittedly, they did quite closely cooperate, but I mean, so what?
Does that ship provide good scuba diving opportunities now? Or?
It's somewhere off Sydney Heads, I believe. It's probably in quite deep water, so probably not.
It's gallows humour anyway. It's horrible to think of these world class vessels just being ditched, and to basically keep peace with America, which then just went on to try and dissolve our empire anyway. It's just tragic.
It really,
So-
it really was, and like like I say, the British get rid of an absolutely rock solid naval alliance with Japan in return for nothing from the Americans.
Yeah.
It was an absolutely ridiculous thing for Britain to go for. I think it was one of the big British between the wars mistakes was the Washington Naval Treaty. Quite honestly, Richard Ford in the chat says the Australian population was 4-6 million back then. I would imagine in the 1920s, 6 million, something like that. I mean, I know it wasn't 8 million at the end of World War II. So
one other thing, I just would be really interested at some point. I should find out more. I should have found out more before this stream, but just what the thinking of the rest of the cabinet was. I mean, we get some insight in Buchanan's book into Churchill's. I don't know what Stanley Baldwin's thinking was. I don't know who else was prominent in the cabinet at the time. I'm not so familiar with the politics of the 20s. I've read a lot about the 30s, so I know a lot of the figures in that. But yeah.
I mean,
we're
going to be moving on to the 1930s just now, but I thought we needed to do some sort of introduction so that people know where we got to last stream. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that one, Ataman, at all before we move into the 1930s?
I mean, Doxastic Draco brought up in the chat. I seriously doubt that an alliance with Nippon would have lasted through the 1930s, given its trajectory. I mean, this is kind of a little bit of my contention is that if they kept going the way they were, they would have run into a situation where some of our territories were sort of, you could say, in their way. I mean,
Well, all I would say, as Horus just pointed out, is that the Japanese turn towards militarism came after the British abandoned the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty. And perhaps, had we not done so, it's obviously impossible to say now because it's what-if history, but had that not been abandoned, maybe Japan wouldn't have turned in that direction. You don't know.
No.
So, I mean, that would be my thinking on that one. And it certainly didn't help because Japan felt that they'd been slighted. And, they were very fond of the Brits. They thought that we were both island seafaring peoples and all this kind of stuff, And the Japanese Navy was heavily modelled on the Royal Navy.
Yeah. Yeah. But, I mean, it's also, I mean, it was kind of an assistance to them, even though they couldn't always wield it effectively, that their navy could like concentrate in essentially that one theatre.
Oh yeah,
as we were always going to be spread out. The empire was always geographically a little bit of a clusterfuck.
Well, this is what I was saying earlier. This is why the Washington Naval Treaty was such a bad deal for Britain, because Britain needed more warships than Japan or America did. All America had to do was have enough warships to defend our east coast and the west coast. Britain couldn't do that. Britain had to have a fleet in the North Sea. Britain had to have a fleet in the Mediterranean back then because we had possessions in the Mediterranean, and the Suez Canal obviously was vital to Britain and the empire. And then we had to have ships in the Indian Ocean and ships in the Pacific. So Britain just
and the Indian Ocean is
a
lot bigger than people often give it credit for as well.
Oh yeah,
and it has to span. It has to the territory span from the African east coast to to obviously India and then even a bit beyond. So it's a vast space to have to occupy.
Well, some of the Indian Ocean goes up to the Australian west coast.
Yeah.
So it's a huge ocean. People often don't realise how big it is. And indeed, in World War II, the Royal Navy played a big part in the Indian Ocean. But under seriously adverse conditions, which we will get onto in a bit. So I think we kind of brought us up to date what was going on into the end of the 1920s. There was the 10-year rule going on, and every year it was just extended for another 10 years. There was not going to be a major war for 10 years, so the 10-year rule just keeps rolling. And Churchill fully supported that. He was one of the biggest supporters of it. The Singapore naval base was built slowly and was much less well defended than the Royal Navy wanted it to be. Again, because Winston Churchill at SUP, the Chancellor, wouldn't give them the money to spend it. Another important thing, by the way, that happened, and we should mention, is that just at the end of World War the Royal Navy lost control of its own aircraft to the RAF, to the Royal Air Force. So that there was no, I mean, what's now the Fleet Air Arm in the Royal Navy did not exist in the 1920s and didn't exist until just prior to World War II, which is one reason why Royal Naval aircraft, with a few exceptions, were somewhat old-fashioned, were not as good as they should have been in World War II, because it was only just before World War II broke out that the Royal Navy got control back over its own aircraft again. And of course, the RAF didn't give two tosses about aircraft that were going to go on aircraft carriers, as they still don't, by the way. But, it's a different story. But yeah, so you got to look at that stuff. What are we looking at? So, sorry, I'm just looking at the chat.
Didn't there also arise a question about how well Singapore should be defended? I don't know whether it was like in case of war or once the war with Japan had started, but isn't there some controversy about, again, Churchill's decisions in regard to how much naval support to send to Singapore?
Isn't this a favourite of yours, Duke?
Yeah, look, it's all right. This is taking us a bit later than we've got to. But
we can save it.
No. We'll deal with it because I might forget otherwise. The British Army had actually done war games, exercises, and realised that what was going to happen in a war against Singapore was that the enemy, and it was almost certainly going to be Japan by this stage in the 1930s, was going to come down the Malayan Peninsula through the jungle and the rubber plantations and all this stuff. And so you needed to be able to defend that stuff. But in order to defend that stuff, you also needed a fairly large and modern air force, neither of which they got. Because, well, I hate to say it, but Winston Churchill in World War II was absolutely dead set on sending every single spare modern aircraft that Britain produced and every single spare tank that Britain produced to that vile scumbag Stalin in the Soviet Union. And so via very expensive Arctic convoys that got a lot of British sailors, both merchant and Royal Navy, killed and lost a lot of good Royal Navy ships. And nothing basically was sent to Malaya and Singapore. So that when the Japanese did attack, the British Army didn't have a single tank in Malaya, not one. And the air force that they had was both very small and very, very second rate.
See, that really makes me think even less of him. I mean, that suggests an obsession with Germany. I mean, Singapore was one of the most important ports and shipping lanes in the world, right?
Yeah,
very valuable.
Churchill was convinced Japan wouldn't actually attack, but then his military and naval judgment was always and invariably awful.
Yes. Well, I mean, we see that with Hitler and Stalin as well, right? Like they often overruled their general. Like Hitler got it right one time where he overruled all his most of his generals and invaded France, and actually it went really well. But then in most of his other decisions throughout the whole war, he overruled his generals to the worst, right? Stalin did it again and again and again through his career. And it looks like Churchill did as well. I'm a little bit extra bitter because my grandfather was captured at Singapore. Yeah. So I'm a little emotional at the mention of it. I mean, I never met him, unfortunately. He died a long time before I was born. But yeah, he was one of the 100,000 odd captured at Singapore.
Yeah.
Needlessly, right? I mean, if you're not going to defend it properly, like you might as well not send many men there, right?
Look, my father knew one of his neighbours in London was a Japanese prisoner of war in World War II, and he came home and he was still quite thin and all the rest of it when he'd been liberated at the end of the war. But he only lived about 3 years.
Right. Yeah. My granddad died in the early 50s, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
because of the hardships that they underwent, it was crazy.
If you're not prepared to defend the colony, you might as well put literally hardly any defence there, or change your strategy and send sufficient force. Which I can understand that's a very difficult decision.
Well, we're going to come on to this stuff in some detail in a bit, so perhaps we'll hold on that one for a bit, because what I want to do is talk a little bit about the early to mid 1930s now, and then we'll come on to this because, like, I want this discussion to basically take us up to the early part of 1942, after which everything is different. So basically, the bit when Britain was fighting on her own, or almost on her own, apart from the old Commonwealth countries and India, of course. But yeah, so as I said, 10-year rule is a rolling rule. Let's say we're in 1930. And the 10-year rule just keeps rolling. Every year of the 10 years is included in that extra another year, so it never gets less than 10 years.
Sorry, just a quick question. Does the 10-year rule pertain to ships specifically?
No, it's all military spending.
Right.
Military spending. The Army, the Air Force, and the Royal Navy. There's going to be no major war for 10 years, so there's no need to spend any money on anything, basically. And like the British Army gets ridiculously tiny, although not as tiny as it is now, I might add. The RAF gets very small and very out of date. The Royal Navy is still the most important British armed force, as it should be, but is still limited to 15 major capital ships. And no new ones actually, the Brits got two ships. They got HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney in the early 1920s because Britain didn't have any 16-inch gun ships, unlike the Americans and Japanese. So Britain was allowed to build Nelson and Rodney, which had 9 16-inch guns and were in gun power the most powerful battleships Britain had in World War II. But they were not very fast. They were only about 23 knots, which is not quick. It's quicker than the American ships, which were mostly 21 knots, but slower than most others. So, although Rodney did a great job blitzing Bismarck, but there we go. So in 1930, you got this 10-year rule. It's rolling every year. Churchill was Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the second most important person. Well, actually, he wasn't in 1930, but he was up until almost 1930. And that's the second most important role in the British government after the Prime Minister, always is. And then basically Churchill finds himself in the wilderness after this during the Stanley Baldwin era. So he's a backbencher, effectively, and a lot of people thought his career was probably over. But you have to remember, he's a bloke who would cross the floor all the time. So, he crossed the floor to leave the Conservatives to join the Liberals over imperial tariff preference in 1908, which to me brands him as anti-British Empire, because that was what imperial tariff preference was all about, trying to make the British Empire something real. At least the old Commonwealth bits of it. And then, of course, he went back to the Conservatives again in the end when he saw that the Liberals weren't doing so well. Do you guys have anything to add to that stuff before we move on a bit further?
No. Yeah, I mean that was a pretty common thing of him. He used to try and read the room and go with the wind on it. He was kind of a shrewd political actor in that sense, at least.
Did he was it when he rejoined the Tories? What was his remark that it takes a special kind of genius or something to re-rat? He said like anyone can rat, but it takes a special kind of genius to re-rat. That's his sort of dark humour, like sort of praising himself for his disloyalty.
But he wasn't trusted by most Conservatives in the 1930s.
Rightly so.
Yeah, and rightly so, actually, because he was never really a Conservative. He was always a Liberal, really.
He was quite favourable to the early welfare state as well.
Yes, he was.
Which is not Conservative whatsoever.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, I think there was a reasonable argument for like basic old age pensions, I have to say. But it was a Liberal move. It wasn't a Conservative thing to do, for sure.
Definitely drags things to the left. I mean, especially when it's when it's the way that welfare always turns out to be financed is basically just by more ultimately more money printing. Sometimes it doesn't appear until a crisis happens, but it does happen.
Yeah, that's very true. It's very true. Cardamon in the chat says the strongest detail of Churchill's early wilderness years was his closeness to the boundaries of fascism. Yeah, Churchill was quite favourable to Italian fascists in the early 1930s. Although I have to say, you really do have to separate Italian fascists from German National Socialists because they weren't the same animal. There were quite a lot of differences.
There's quite a lot.
Just one thing, for example, Italian fascists. There were lots of Jewish Italian fascists,
including Mussolini's mistress, right?
Yeah,
and quite a lot of Jews in Italy joined the fascist party, I think, as well.
Yeah, and under Mussolini, so long as Mussolini actually ran Italy, no Italian Jews were killed.
Although I will say that despite the animosity amongst some in Italy against the Germans because of the stance on Jews, there was very real reasons why, like, Jews in Italy fit into that society significantly better than Jews in Germany.
Oh yeah, look, I'm not arguing about that. I don't even want to get involved in that discussion because if we do, YouTube will yeet us. Yeah. So we've got to be very careful on that stuff. But all I'm trying to point out is that Italian fascism was not anti-Semitic. And when you're talking about Italian fascists, because these days the left do this all the time. They call everyone fascist. And Italian fascists were nothing like German National Socialists in some respects. They were two different animals.
I think, like, with there's quite a list of prominent people who had kind words for Mussolini, wasn't there? I think that would have held as well if it hadn't been for the war that came, at the end of the 30s. I think, like, Mussolini was someone a lot. I mean, Roosevelt praised a fair few things about how Mussolini ran Italy. Yes. David Lloyd George did as well. He was still a big deal in Britain until the 30s.
Well, FDR was fairly fascistic himself in the way he ran America. So, There's
a book, Liberal Fascism by Jonah Goldberg. I think overall it's a rubbish book, but it's crap. It is crap, and it's so damn long as well. God, but he does show in that Roosevelt, I mean, was quite clearly supportive of fascist economic policy in certain ways.
Yeah, by the long road, we've actually ended up adopting almost all of his economic policies here in the West, or at least all the good ones, anyway.
Yes, some of them. Yeah.
So,
if you want to know about Italian fascism, you need to read Paul Gottfried's book, "Fascism: The Career of an Ideology." Is it the career of
the career of a concept? I think it's called.
Yeah, the career of a concept. That's much the best book there is on fascism, as far as I understand it.
There's actually a really good stream as well with which that Mr. Patriarch guy did with Paul on the book, which is pretty good.
Yes, I watched that. That's well worth seeing as well, actually. But it's an interesting book, and when I look at the leaders of World War II, like of the major countries in World War II. I detest Hitler and I detest Stalin. Don't like either of them. I deeply dislike Churchill, FDR, and Tojo, the Japanese leader. And I always feel a little bit sorry for Mussolini, to be honest with you, because I just do.
The way that the difference between how Mussolini and Hitler were received by other leaders as well. I mean, there was obviously like 10 years or so between them coming into power, right? And I think, like, with Mussolini, I think he started the fascist party during or just before, maybe, but really started to sort of get active during what they call the Red Biennium, right? The 2 red years, which was 1918 to 20, I think. Immediately after the First World War, there was a considerable, like, communist rampage all over Italy. Just like thugs and, organised thuggery, like taking over factories, taking over farms, just by force. And in some cases, killing, farm owners, factory owners and stuff. And when Mussolini had a remarkably easy path to power. Like, compared to how some people get to power. But like it's partly because like the Italian sort of centrist parties, almost by their own admission, just kind of gave up on fighting the Reds. They were like, well, to fight them would violate our ideology, and unfortunately the latter thing is more important. So they kind of allowed Mussolini to take over in some ways.
That's the story of every Western conservative party now.
Yeah.
If I can't, if only, I hesitate to with my words, but if only something like that could happen now, I mean, like, I'm not really calling for a Mussolini exactly, but something that is against the Reds, and against the treason that we're experiencing now. I'll go no further than that.
Yeah. Listen, I totally agree with you. Our current so-called elites are traitors. I no other way to describe them. I'm sorry.
Yeah. They're proud of it.
Yeah, they have no interest whatsoever in the native Anglo-Celtic British people. No. And that goes to the people.
Having a civilized society, to be honest.
Yeah, and you could say the same about every Anglosphere nation and almost every Western nation.
They seem like nihilists almost. But I was good at about what we said about Mussolini. Then you had Hitler's path to power was somewhat different. I mean, he was kind of helped into power by people like Franz von Papen and, very reluctantly Paul von Hindenburg and some other. But obviously the situation was different, and it was 10 years on. And I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what you guys think. But there's that instance of Churchill having been in Germany before Hitler came to power. I think the NSDAP were already a big party in the Reichstag by then, but not, they weren't in charge. And Hitler was, I think Churchill met with, was it Franz Hanfstaengl? And Hanfstaengl offered to for him and Churchill, him and Hitler to meet that evening. But I think, was it one of the other of them didn't want it,
It didn't happen. It narrowly didn't happen.
I mean, I doubt it would have changed history that much, but there was already a sort of dislike between them at that point, I think, before.
And by that stage, of course, Churchill was in the wilderness. He was a backbencher. He didn't have any influence on the British government, and in fact was actively disliked by many conservatives with good reason.
I think he'd been a bad minister in lots of ways, hadn't he?
Well, not only that, it was his crossing and recrossing of the floor which left a bad taste in people's mouths. I mean, just imagine if you had a conservative who joined the Labour Party and then went back and joined the Conservative Party. I mean, all right, you could argue these days there's not much difference between the two of them, but it's,
or imagine if you had a manic Lib Dem Remainer going for trying to become the Tory MP Prime Minister. Oh no, wait.
Imagine, yes, just imagine. Liz Truss.
Horrifying.
I mean, that's the story of that party now, though, isn't it? It's just full of libs. They've crossed the floor.
I have long said I don't want to make this a current affairs stream because we do one every weekend. But I have long said that we need to support, if there are individual Conservative MPs who are actually Conservative, by all means support them. But in general terms, the real right needs to stop supporting the Conservative Party.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
That's like your whole shtick, isn't it, Horus? It's like the culmination of all your videos. it's stop backing the Conservatives.
and a lot of posting on Twitter and Telegram and Facebook as well. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, that to me is an obvious thing now. But I mean, Britain badly needs a third real right of centre party that is not run by somebody who is too identified with, shall we say, mid-20th century Germans.
I think the need to attack the Tories is especially strong here because we have first past the post as well, and they are literally occupying the space where there should be a right-wing party. In Germany, France, it's a little different. There is space for several. But here, ultimately, almost everyone thinks a vote for anyone other than the big 3 or 4 is a wasted vote. So
which it isn't. Unless we can get that across to people, nothing's ever going to change. Although I'm not optimistic. I'm not totally black-pilled, but I'm not optimistic about it, I have to say. I mean,
Yeah,
for
actually,
one
I
thing,
won't go down that. I won't go further into this because I know you say it's not a topical show. But
well, I mean, look, it isn't, but I mean, I must just say that, like, the trouble with the real right of centre British parties, the various small ones, they spend more time slagging off each other than they do attacking the Conservatives. So, you know, that's half their problem.
I've got like just as a little aid memoir, I've got the Wikipedia page of Winston Churchill open while we're doing this, and I noticed that he did actually do one decent thing. He resigned from, well, tell me what you guys think, but he resigned from the Tory shadow cabinet in January 1931 over the threat of India being given home rule. I don't know what's the right thing to do there, but at least it suggested that he wasn't always destroying the empire like sometimes he did.
He actually expended a lot of energy on that, which was never going to change anything.
Right.
I think he was right. Actually, that's one of the few occasions where I do think he was right, but it was not going to be, in practical political terms, it wasn't going to be changed.
I like his quote about Mohandas Gandhi as well, and I stress Mohandas Gandhi because he ain't. There is no Mahatma to me. Who he referred to as a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir, like an Islamic.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, absolutely correct. He was in South Africa originally, and he was a very middle class lawyer, and as Churchill said, basically in later years he posed as a fakir. So. But he never was. He was actually a very middle class lawyer dude.
And he had a fixation on Britain as the enemy. A bit like there's various other Indian figures like that as well, like Subhash Chandra Bose, who caused a lot of problems.
He was the guy who started what the British and Indian Army called the Indian Traitor Army that supported Japan in World War II.
Yeah. I can understand fighting the British. I can't understand joining Japan, as if Japan's not going to take over and can you imagine? Imagine Japanese government of India. I mean, it'd be
everywhere Japan governed, they weren't exactly in favour of the locals. It has to be said.
They would have been competing with the Mughals for sheer amount of bloodshed.
But the Indian National Party, when they got independence in 1947. After that, they have increasingly promoted some of these Indian traitor army dudes as being good blokes over the people who won things like Victoria Crosses fighting with the Brits.
I've read a little bit about Indian politics since it was granted independence, and the Congress Party, it was effectively anyway, not by formally, but effectively a mono-party state until the 2000s. When some new party, I think it was the Hindu Nationalist Party, got in the 2000s. But nearly every prime minister of India was like, sort of like an anti-colonial leftist. They were very friendly to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Gandhi family, the Nehru family. It's a different Gandhi family from. It's just a coincidence. But Indira Gandhi happens to have the same name. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether India even could have been held onto in the long term.
Oh no, I don't think it could because of what the British government had been doing after World War One, basically. In the long term, it wasn't going to be held on. Richard Ford in the chat said he favoured the brown. This is Churchill favoured the brown empire over the white empire. I actually think he did. To be honest, I think there is a lot of truth in that, Richard Ford.
Which is an oddly anti-liberal position for the time.
Maybe not really. If you think about it, the liberals...
something like the Montague Project, which was like well underway by sort of like 1910. That was a very much a liberal project.
So Edwin Montague was that?
It was. Yeah, they were like trying to work out how they could get home rule in India. Right. And he kind of bucked the trend on that one issue, which was a bit unusual.
So that preceded the First World War, and so was that out of actual liberal ideology, or was that because India was becoming a liability, or what?
I think it was broadly out of liberal ideology. They weren't sort of in line with the like what they used to call themselves, the Little Englanders. Then obviously it's completely different now. But
Well, the British in India trained up an Indian middle class at schools and universities that we started, the British started, and then were surprised that this Indian middle class then wanted power. So
and that's where Gandhi and Nehru and people like that came out of, right?
Absolutely right. Yeah, they went often with grants and what have you from the Brits to universities, sometimes in Britain, but also we set up universities in India and all this sort of thing. And then we were surprised that these middle-class Indians actually wanted power, which to me is somewhat stupid because that's what's going to happen when you do that. But, we're getting a little bit off topic and we've been going for 50 minutes. So we're in the 1930s and the 10-year rule is rolling on, as I have said. Churchill's out in the wilderness, and it was in the, I suppose you could say it was about, 35 that Churchill first started sounding off about Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. Would you guys agree it was about 1935?
it's got to be about that. Or was it not a little bit earlier?
Not much, because Hitler only came to power in 1933. And with the best will in the world, he couldn't rearm Germany in a year. But he did start to rearm Germany soon after he came to power. Not very well to start with, it has to be said. Like the early German tanks were shit little things, and with machine guns only. And the German Air Force was somewhat exaggerated, not least by Winston Churchill. But But by about 1935, Churchill had started on his shtick about Hitler was rearming Germany and Britain needed to rearm. And the 10-year rule that he had supported for the previous 10 years, he suddenly thought was out of date. Why Germany was a particular threat to Britain, I'm not quite sure. Hitler always made it very, very clear that he was going east. Everything he ever wrote, he was going to attack the East. He wanted Lebensraum in the East and all the rest of it. He never, so far as I know, even spoke about attacking France, let alone Britain. But Churchill decided, no, Hitler's rearming, and and of course
Doesn't he kind of imply in Mein Kampf that I'm not even sure if I should say that on YouTube? Doesn't he kind of imply in that book that that he kind of viewed France as like a bit of a perpetual enemy? They were always going to try and keep the Germans down.
I think he does, but he never talks about attacking them.
No.
Yeah, he speaks about them very angrily, but it's almost all referring to things that happened since the First World War.
Yeah.
And like Clemenceau at Versailles was such a nasty influence on everything. That sort of vengeful, but also kind of like, I don't know, bitter, like, what's the word? Like sort of jealous, even like envious. Like this sort of, France had just become quite frank about its inferiority, like in terms of, well, obviously inferior in terms of manpower and the organisation of its industry and stuff. I think France just become like quite openly just obsessively anti-German in a lot of ways. He seems angry, especially about Versailles, yeah, and the need to sort of revise that. And the way that, well, I think France did spend the 20s and 30s just constantly trying to work with Germany's enemies. I mean, they made, like, I think immediately, like, within a couple of years after the First World War, they made alliances with, they were not that dependable alliances, but they were a signal of intent with
Czechoslovakia and people like that, yeah.
Poland, to try and, I don't know, just to try and menace Germany, like, you start on us and you've got a problem on your east as well. I mean, I can understand it, but it was a bit kind of ill considered on France's part. They were just like,
well, they were desperate to make up for losing Russia as an ally, weren't they? So they were just getting this little basket of crappy little countries.
It was called the Little Entente.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. So was it with Romania? Were they involved as well?
I don't think Romania were, but Czechoslovakia certainly was, and Poland may have been.
And all these countries, I mean, like I would say, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I don't claim to be an expert on this, but I would say to all of them, like all right, so you're facing the German threat, and that is real. Germany, even under other leaders, does have a desire to spread eastward in a lot of, like Labour. That's what Labour's really meant, like colonising and just sort of ignoring whoever was there already.
Let's remember that certainly up until 1938, Germany would have preferred some sort of deal with Poland than fighting Poland.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they I mean, they had a lot of antagonism, sort of personally, but they both had an interest in peace with each other. They both faced the menace of Marxism.
Yeah, they were both scared of the Soviet Union to some degree, or wary of the Soviet Union, shall we say.
I made a series of videos a few years ago about the Second World War, about the causes of the Second World War mostly. And mostly that starts in about 35, 36. So it's we haven't quite got to that. Well, we're sort of getting up to that point now. But the question of the Czech government, that was very friendly to the Soviets. And geographically, the Czech government was the Czech territory was a big problem became a bigger problem for Germany after the Anschluss, actually. Hitler's remark about it's like a dagger pointing into Germany. Obviously, that was Germany plus Austria by that point. So, but Edvard Beneš was like a close friend of Stalin, like a good friend of Stalin. So that I have some sympathy with Hitler's antagonism towards the Czechs. Towards Beneš specifically. Sorry, you were going to say.
I just wanted to answer Richard Ford's question in the chat. He asked me, because he's asked me twice now. In theory, if we gave up the Brown Empire, could we have saved the White Empire? I would say not, because it was India that made Britain a superpower in the Far East, because the manpower we got there. Don't forget, even in World War II, the Indian Army was the largest non-conscripted army the world has ever seen, because there was never any conscription in any of the Brown British Empire. It was only in the white countries there was conscription, and only some of them, like there was never conscription in Canada. There was only semi-conscription in Australia, because they couldn't make you join the Australian Imperial Force, which could be sent anywhere. But they could make you join the militia, which was basically like a territorial army type story. New Zealand, I don't think ever had conscription either, but I'm not sure about that. But New Zealand had one superb division basically.
But you've also got to think that, you're then spread from sort of South Africa. You're going to have Singapore anyway, whether it's not white or not, because it's a good strategic point.
Yeah.
And then you've got this massive expanse between South Africa and Australia. India kind of just fills in the gap, and then of course Egypt and those sections of North Africa are good because they secure the canal and your routes between those various points, so you haven't got to go all the way down and around the Cape.
Yeah, I mean, look,
and the thing is as well, if you can hold the Indian coast, it is a massive coast, but if you can hold it, you've got a huge amount of land to use,
and a big population that can provide a very large army.
I mean, I'd say the problem with that was we always spent a bit too much time out there doing humanitarian stuff, building them up.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that at all. But Richard's point is that what did we need the army for exactly? It made Britain a superpower in the Far East. That's what it was for. Sorry, that's just what it was for. Because it meant Britain could put 10 divisions anywhere they wanted in the Far East. And don't forget, an Indian division in World War II was not Indian. An Indian division in World War II was a third British. So you would have, in an infantry division, you would have 3 brigades, and each brigade would have 3 battalions. And of those 3 battalions, 1 battalion would be British. So you'd have 3 British and 6 Indian battalions in every infantry division. Most of the artillery was British, and more than half of the armor was British. So when they talk about Indian divisions in World War II, people often get confused and they think, oh, those guys are all Indians or Gurkhas back then as well. No, a third of every Indian division was British. And even in the Middle East, like O'Connor's army had a brilliant, excellent Indian division, which, as I say, was a third British. So that's what it was for. So all I'm saying, Richard, is that giving up the Brown Empire would not have enabled Britain to easily save the White Empire. because as Ataman just pointed out, you've still got to defend Australia and New Zealand. You've still got to defend South Africa back then, and you've still got to defend Canada. So,
What was the Brown Empire? Just it
was India, which of course was these days you would say India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, plus of course Sri Lanka, which was called Ceylon back then. That was all
Nepal as well.
Nepal was never a British colony, but Malaya and Burma certainly were, and Singapore, of course. And then you had like a lot of different countries in Africa, and then you had various West Indian places, some of which are still British to this day. You had Belize in Central America. You had British Honduras in South America. Obviously, the Falkland Islands, although that's part of the White Empire, I suppose. Also umpteen islands in the Pacific back then were also British.
I see the reason for the question, but I mean, I would say they were governed by British people, weren't they, or British descended people? So I think, as long as you can maintain that, which in some places you can't, but as long as you can maintain that, it's effectively still a white empire. But I take the point of the question.
Richard Ford, an Indian army which is British could have been in. I don't understand your question there, mate. I'm sorry. I don't understand what you're getting at there. Oh, okay. Well, look, Richard, this is like you can argue this, but this is not the place to do it because this is a stream about history. And if you want to change history, you can do that, but that's a different subject. And I'm not real big into what if fantasy history, to be honest. But yeah. Cardamom in the chat is right. The 4th Indian Division fought very well in North Africa. Yes, they did. And many Indian divisions fought very well in Burma as well. So, and they might have fought quite well in Singapore. In Singapore and Malaya, had they been given more of a chance. But, but like I said, we've been going just over an hour. We've got fairly sidetracked. So let's go back to Churchill starting to go off about the Germans in about 1935.
I need to read more biographies really of Churchill. I've read a fair bit of Churchill's War by David Irving, but there's obviously Martin Gilbert's done a famous biography of him. Yeah. Roy Jenkins did one as well, and I haven't read. I mean, I could obviously Gilbert was head of the Churchill Society and his official biographer. So I'm sorry about the noise.
You're not going to find Gilbert's biography being critical at all, really. To be honest, in fact, I'd say it was a waste of time reading it. To be honest. Right.
So I might read Roy Jenkins' one. I don't know if that's going to be the same or what. But,
I doubt if that's going to be much better. I mean, I'm not a bit. Are you talking about Roy Jenkins, the Labour politician?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
I
wouldn't expect much from that, to be honest. But
yeah,
anyway.
I mean, Jenkins is quite an interesting figure, but not in a good way. I don't know.
It's difficult to get a biography of Churchill, which is not totally hostile or totally in favour.
Right.
You need something in the middle, and they are very few and far between, I would say.
Yeah, I don't know of one. If anyone wants to post the title of one in the chat.
Yeah, go for it, guys. If someone knows one, put it up in the chat, and I'll stick it on the screen.
Because, I mean, Irving, from the first few pages, you can tell, okay, right, he hates this guy.
Yeah, he's more anti-Churchill than I am, and I'm not a big fan.
Yeah, I mean, Irving clearly favours, National Socialist Germany. He clearly quite admires it, and, so it makes one somewhat dubious. But I would say, I mean, he addresses the question of Churchill having been bought, having been bribed. Now, I think this is very...
Can we come on to that in a minute? Because I want to say something first before we get to that. Although I absolutely do want to speak about that. One of the things Churchill does from 1935 onwards is he starts harrying the British government to vastly increase the RAF against the German Air Force threat. Yeah. Now, had the British government done what Churchill wanted them to do in 1935, the RAF would have ended up with a huge number of obsolete or obsolescent biplanes, because that's what we had at that stage. So it was really very sensible of the British government not to take any notice of Winston Churchill, because
Seriously,
we would have ended up.
biplanes.
Yeah, because Britain was still building biplane fighters like the Gloucester Gladiator up until 1938. So in 1935, I mean, so were the Germans. Don't get me wrong. The Luftwaffe, the early Luftwaffe, they had plenty of biplanes too. They only got the Bf 109, for example, in about 1936, I think, and slowly they got more of them. But when they sent the Condor Legion to Spain to back Franco in the Spanish Civil War, the Condor Legion took loads of biplanes with it, because that's what the German Air Force had at the time. But had the British government done what Winston Churchill wanted them to do in the middle of the 1930s, the RAF would have been totally useless.
You know what song is running through my head now? It's those magnificent men in their flying machines.
Oh look, the Gloucester Gladiator biplanes, they fought on Royal Navy aircraft carriers. 2 squadrons of them actually fought in the Battle of Britain. Very few people know that, but they did.
Wow.
They defended Malta in the early days against the Italians, and the Italians had loads of biplanes as well, by the way. And they also fought in North Africa for quite a while. So, you know, the Gloucester Gladiator was good as a biplane fighter goes, but it was a biplane fighter. And if the government had done what Churchill wanted in the mid-1930s, the RAF would have ended up with a load of junk by 1940.
Well, that connects to, it is an interesting book. I never made a video on this, but I don't know if you guys have read it. It's I think it's called, right, you know A.J.P. Taylor did his Origins of the Second World War. I think there's another book with the same title by Richard Overy, if not a very similar title. And Richard Overy is like, you know, a current historian. I think he's still going. And he addresses especially the sort of material questions of like, so he talks especially about Churchill. I know we've not got as far as Chamberlain yet, but Chamberlain's so-called, you know, like Chamberlain's like widely portrayed as just not seeing the threat, not taking Hitler seriously, which is not true at all. Chamberlain prepared for war with Germany and with, you know, whoever else, but obviously Germany was the one that was on everyone's mind.
He prepared too slowly, but yes, he was preparing, and he was trying to do it without breaking the British economy.
Right, this is it. I mean, that's something like no one ever talks about in relation to Churchill, like the cost of what he proposed. I mean, he proposed different things quite a lot of the time, right? Like changed his mind on things. And like Richard Overy tackles the question of, you needed your peak arms production to arrive at the right time. And obviously you can't get that perfect. But if you believe you're going to have a war, you want to estimate how long the war will be, obviously who you're going to be fighting, how many fronts, and how many enemies and what equipment they've got. But especially you want your peak arms production to arrive at the right point so that you can sustain that for the shortest time possible and still win, and avoid the expense of like full production, full mobilization going on longer than a few years, which is ruinous. Right?
I totally agree with you, Horus. And Richard Ford had just said in the chat, Chamberlain was a good man, to be honest. I don't disagree with that. I would just say this. Where Chamberlain made his mistake, and again, this is jumping forward from where we are here, but where Chamberlain made his mistake was giving that big red war button to Poland. The Royal Navy, for example, was being prepared for war on the basis it would break out in 1941 or 1942. And had that happened, the Royal Navy would have been immensely stronger than it was in 1939. And the only reason war broke out in 1939 for Britain was because Chamberlain gave that ridiculous guarantee to Poland.
Yeah,
but that is so jumping ahead that we'll have to come back to it. I wanted to get on to what someone else said in the chat just now. Here we are. Baron Badger says, Churchill was always broke and in hoc, Chubanka friends. This is true. Winston Churchill, especially after he was no longer a minister, spent most of the 1930s living way beyond his means. And he made some of that money by writing for some really trashy American magazines and stuff. Like Churchill wrote for some people you'd be very surprised. and about some subjects you'd be quite surprised about too. Like he'd write on anything that would pay him, basically. But yes, he was always broke, and he was always in hock to assorted friends, some of whom were certainly bankers. We've got to be a little bit careful here what we say, because this is YouTube and it's not a free speech platform. But the focus group that Churchill became the leader of had a certain ethnic leaning, shall we say.
Yeah, it was organised by Samuel Untermeyer primarily, and I think Rabbi Stephen Wise, who were both very close to Roosevelt as well, or became close to him over the 30s, I think. They would have told you if you interviewed them about it at the time, they would have said so themselves. We are concerned as members of this ethnic group. We're concerned about what this means for us, in Germany and across the world. I think, especially non-German Jews, actually, I think they were more concerned about. They were pretty callous towards Jews in Germany, but they would have said themselves at the time, we are acting on an ethnic basis or whatever, a tribal basis, and from what I can tell, this is pretty clearly documented. I think. Well, right, here's maybe the contentious bit. I think that all the reasons Churchill gave for being concerned about Hitler, about Germany's sort of increasing armament and so on, I think he was lying. I think he was giving pretexts to cover for the fact that, he had been bought. I've come to this view in the last sort of year or two, having read more since, after I made that series of videos which didn't address this. But
the only reason I might dispute that a little bit, Horus, would be that he was no different in the 1930s than he had been in the 1910s. Right. About Wilhelmine Germany, under the Kaiser.
About what? Sorry?
He was no different really in the 1930s. Yeah, Wilhelmine Germany under the Kaiser. He was equally anti-German there.
Is that said? Is it Wilhelmine? Is that how you pronounce it?
I think it's Wilhelmine. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and he was always quite keen on war as well as Buchanan.
Yeah, he was a war fighter. There's no doubt whatsoever that
he actually enjoyed it. He actually
one of the few people who did.
Found it thrilling, which I think is suggests some sort of mental imbalance myself. I think Ed Dutton.
He wasn't a coward, mind you. I think we may have mentioned this on the last stream. He was personally quite a brave man. He took part in one of the last great cavalry charges in the British Empire in 1898 at Omdurman, where about a third of the regiment was killed or wounded because they charged these dervishes, and instead of being a few hundred of them, there was a sunken riverbed behind with thousands more in it, and the 21st Lancers had to cut their way through all this lot, and about a third of the men got killed or wounded, and then turned around and said they would go back if they were ordered to, because the British Army was nothing if not brave. And Churchill took part in that. He was personally a brave man, but yes, he loved being in positions of power during war, and he found that thrilling, and he's quite unpleasant in that way.
Yeah, and in regards to his attitude to Germany, I mean, I do have the impression. I mean, certainly, his behaviour in the 40s would confirm this. His, using terms like the Krauts and all this stuff. He did develop some sort of, I don't know if you call it racial or national enmity towards Germany at some point. On the other hand, there were occasions where he stood up for Germany. Actually, I'm thinking about after the war, so that's a different matter, isn't it? Because when the pre-European Union, the organisations that later became the European Union, when they were being founded, obviously Churchill had a role in setting those up, and he said Germany has to be involved in this. You can't do this without Germany. They're missing. We need them in this.
Yeah.
So that suggests that at least in his very late life, he began to regard them as human again. But he did have it. But he spoke disparagingly of other nations as well, didn't he? I mean, he said
mostly. No, really, it was more Germany than anyone else, to be honest.
Okay, right. So that was a long-standing thing.
Oh yeah. Like I said, he was rabidly pro-war against Germany in the 1910s. Yeah, and
I think he helped stir up the hatred in the 1900s as well. That sort of gradually built up over that as well.
I mean, to be fair, part of that was Germany's fault, as we spoke about in the first part of the stream. Germany built up a navy which was only aimed at Britain.
Right.
And the Royal Navy was like absolutely essential to Britain, because without the Royal Navy, anyone could invade us and win, because the British Army was relatively small. Not as small as it is now, but relatively small. But all I'm trying to say is that the idea that Churchill was bought and paid for, I think, is a very big oversimplification. I think he was always pretty anti-German.
He was receptive. He was the right man for them to approach.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Actually, yeah, he was the perfect target for them. I did look into some sort of lefty criticisms of the talk about the focus group, and it did seem to be full of a lot of coke. There's apparently a book about the focus group called like the Footnote of History or something. And people always just quote the title and go, "Oh yes, see, a footnote of no importance."
Yeah. I mean, it became quite influential. There were quite a lot of people within the British government who decided to support it, and were passing Churchill papers that he shouldn't have been able to see.
Although I'll also point out,
Churchill was. Sorry, I was just going to say he was also exaggerating. Churchill was exaggerating the strength of the German armed forces in the mid 1930s, particularly the Air Force.
But,
sorry, carry on.
What was I going to say? So I mean, one of the things I found kind of interesting is actually British intelligence services did try to lock up some of the members of the focus group.
Yeah.
Because they came in as immigrants, and they used that as a pretense to claim they might be German spies and sort of lock them away, which is obviously not true. And apparently Churchill was trying to get some of these people released, but
true. But like I said, they were passing Churchill state secret papers, which they shouldn't have been doing. So
So do you guys know if was Leo Amery part of the focus? Was he in that circle?
He was peripherally involved in it. Yes.
Because he's the one who, in May 1940, he was the one who shouted out in Parliament, "For God's sake, man, just go," to Chamberlain, which is always quoted as the moment when Chamberlain sort of lost his courage and slunk off. I don't know how important that moment.
I just think it was too late for Chamberlain then. Anyway, even though
he lost his credibility.
The reason Chamberlain was getting slagged off in 1940 was because of the Norwegian campaign, which had mainly been planned by Churchill.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, if anything, Chamberlain was too soft in bringing Churchill into the war cabinet. I mean, it was hard not to at that point, but because I think Chamberlain, as soon as he became prime minister, he realised that, well, not as soon as, but within, like the year or so before the war began, I think he realised that we're leaping forward into the late 30s a bit, but I think he saw Churchill as a threat, sort of how Churchill saw Germany as a threat. I suppose weak comparison, but he saw himself as needing to stay in place as long as possible. But to stop Churchill becoming prime minister, that was one of the factors, or one of the other sort of pro-war people like Duff Cooper or maybe Amery, but they didn't have the personality that Churchill did.
All right, let's take this just a little bit back, because we'll come on to what you're talking about there, Horus. If not in this stream, on the next one. Let's go back to German Moustache Man's first move, shall we say, when he reoccupied the Rhineland.
Yeah, Buchanan gives quite a clear reason for why it was sensible for Germany to do that.
Yeah, no, look, I'm not arguing whether it was sensible or not for Germany to do that. But I mean, if France, for example, was going to do something, that is when they should have done it. But they weren't willing to do so, partly because the British said, "Well, we're not getting involved in that."
This is strange dance all through the sort of from about 34 to 39 between Britain and France. Like they were like tight. They were like, formally friends and sort of with their entente, obviously. But they obviously pissed each other off all the time, like with their, neither one ever committing to anything in regard to Germany and so on. And I think Britain being allied with France has been a disaster from start to finish.
Oh yeah, look, I don't disagree with that at all. But I mean, it's a fact that had the French reacted strongly to that, the German battalions that were reoccupying the Rhineland had orders to retreat.
Yeah,
like they were told, if the French do anything, retreat, don't fight them.
Was it one division that Germany sent, or even less?
It was less than that, mate. It was
one battalion or something.
No, it was like a brigade. It was like 3 or 4 battalions. But the French easily could have crushed that had they wished to, because the France had a relatively big army because they had conscription, and they didn't do a thing. So, one of the things that always gets me about what was going on in the 1930s was, if you really wanted to put your foot down on Moustache Man, that was when you should have done it, because you could have.
Is there a clear answer for why France didn't do that?
I guess they were scared.
Because I think they thought that through all their governments kept falling all the time. They had new ones like less than, more than once every year they had a new government, right? And I think they kept thinking that they couldn't move without the British, because if they did, they might lose the British for good, and Britain might even become friends with Germany and so on. I think there was a lot of that in France. They were just that it's hard to make firm decisions when your governments keep falling anyway. And they got it into their heads that they needed to be in concert with Britain as much as possible. And Britain sort of knew itself to be superior, so kept denying France that sort of consistency and so on. I've got I've got plenty of sympathy for the French people, but I think that France was a constant antagonist all through the first sort of 30 years of the 20th century.
But then they didn't. But then they didn't do anything when they had the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, an antagonist and pathetic in a way. Yeah, they just. I blame them.
Jules Roy in the chat says France was bitterly divided. The Third Republic a complete mess. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I mean, it was true. I mean, France had a succession of very weak governments. They had a very strong socialist movement in France. They had a fairly strong semi-fascist movement in France. So there was a lot of division and what have you within the French, for sure. But if you were, like I said, if you were gonna step on Moustache Man when he reoccupied the Rhineland, was the time to do it, because Germany was still very weak.
Yeah,
and as I said, the German battalions invading the Rhineland, walking into the Rhineland, reoccupying it, whatever you want to call it, they actually had orders from the German general staff to retreat if the French did anything. The French did nothing.
It was like a cheeky move, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of got to admire the balls of just, let's have a go. I mean, we lose nothing. Well, I suppose that doesn't take balls, does it, if you lose nothing? But it's actually quite a canny move. It's like, let's just see what we can do.
Well, I think it would have been an enormous embarrassment, had the French reacted and sent 2 divisions into the Rhineland, and those German battalions had to come scurrying back.
So the Goebbels...
Adolf babes would have been in big trouble,
Goebbels would have spun it to pretend that they never sent anyone in. It's just French propaganda or something.
Yeah, probably so. Yes, probably so. So that's the first point where you can push back. And then what I wanted to talk about was Mussolini and the invasion of Abyssinia. But before I do, Armin, did you have anything to add to where we got to so far?
No, I'm just along for the ride at this point. Keep going.
All right. Well, Mussolini did not like Hitler and the National Socialists. They were not mates. Certainly not in the early years. In fact, when the Anschluss took place, Mussolini sent Italian divisions to the Brenner Pass in the Alps.
Yeah, it looks like on several occasions Mussolini was actually ready to fight Germany, if anything.
Yes.
I mean, maybe not capable, but
he was ready to be an ally to Britain and France rather than Germany, for sure.
And did join the Strasser Front, right?
Yes, he did. Yes.
And I can't remember this full. I'm sorry, I should have prepared for this stream better, but I can't remember the full sequence of events that led to the Strasser Front dissolving. But I mean, that was Britain, France, Italy, and another country, I think. But they were actually, there was a formal front to stop Germany expanding in any westward or southern direction, right? That was an anti-German alliance basically, but it was scuppered quite quickly. It only lasted like 2 years or something, right?
Yeah.
I think Italy obviously thought that they would get away with the invasion of Abyssinia, and largely did, but it had knock-on effects that led to the Stresa Front dissolving. I think I'm right there.
Yeah, it probably shouldn't have, though. I mean, they weren't really doing anything we should have been getting angry about.
No. Why did Britain care about Italy invading Abyssinia, a country they'd been involved in for by the late 1930s? Italy had been involved in Abyssinia for almost 50 years.
And there's a bit of an anecdote actually in the Buchanan book where he says about someone just stopping Churchill in the street and saying, why can we tell the Italians that they can't have a colony overseas?
Yeah.
And I mean, of course, he's some crap about how it's different because we took ours a long time ago, but times have changed.
It's absolute bullshit, of course. But, yeah.
It gives us like the Justin Trudeau answer, like because it's 1935. You just don't do that now.
But I mean, to be fair, like I said, Italy had been involved in Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia these days, for anyone who's interested. And they'd been involved there for almost 50 years. There was an enormous Italian defeat in 1896 at a place called Adwa, where far, far more Italians were killed than the Brits lost at, say, San Luan, or the Americans lost at Little Bighorn. Thousands of Italians were killed by an enormous Abyssinian army. And the Brits actually did some stuff to help the Italians out, because we were in the Sudan next door and in Kenya next door. And British and Italian colonists on both sides of the border of Kenya, etc., got on fine. You know, there was no problem. And to be honest, was Italy going to run Abyssinia worse than Haile Selassie? Probably not. You know, to be honest, probably not. But for some reason, well, actually, let's say that it was actually Anthony Eden more than anybody else. Anthony Eden decided Britain was going to make Italy an enemy over Abyssinia, which was crazy because, like, you know, the Royal Navy, if they had to fight the German Navy in World War II was never very big. The Royal Navy was always easily able to cope with it. You know, we got the odd disaster like HMS Wood getting sunk, but like Bismarck was sunk only a few days later. And generally speaking, the Royal Navy could cope with the German Navy quite easily because the German Navy was not very big in World War II. I mean, we sank half their destroyers in the Norwegian campaign, which is one reason that Germany could never have done Operation Sea Lion. They just didn't have enough naval ships to escort the people over. It was always a total fantasy. But the Royal Navies also knew that they'd probably have to fight Japan at some point in the Far East. And the nightmare scenario for the Royal Navy was to have enough ships in European waters to fight the German Navy, to have ships in the Far East to fight the Japanese Navy, and then to have ships in the Mediterranean to fight the quite large and pretty good Italian Navy. And Britain deliberately, well, Anthony Eden specifically, who was a Churchill acolyte, specifically made Mussolini and the Italians enemies for no good reason over Abyssinia. I mean, why did Britain care over Abyssinia?
It was a slave state as well.
Yeah, there was slavery in Abyssinia. Absolutely, there was. And there wasn't in Italian colonies. It was illegal. But, it's a bit like, why must Britain make enemies of the Russians over bloody Ukraine? You know, it's the same kind of situation we're in today.
What was Eden's reasoning? Was he just a progressive, or what? What was it?
I really have never worked it out what his reasoning was, to be honest. Although, of course, all of this stuff came back to bite Eden on the bum in 1956. So, you know.
He was a complicated figure. He took very unpredictable positions on all sorts of things for his life. I think he was quite sort of fluid in how he thought.
quite emotional, I think, is the way
that is,
he was
Mm.
quite an emotional man. Like, he regarded Nasser in Egypt as like another Adolf Hitler. Wherever we heard that before. But I mean, listen, don't get me wrong. I fully supported what Eden did in 1956, and I think the Americans were scum to sabotage Britain's, and because militarily it was going great, Egypt wasn't going to beat Britain in 1956. Nowadays they probably could, but not then. There's so much hypocrisy about Eden, and he was a big Churchill acolyte. He was groomed to take over from Churchill, which is why he did.
It's really like poor judgment to make an enemy of Italy, really. I mean, not to be friends with them at just any cost, but obviously Britain, the Mediterranean was crucial, right? I mean, that was the link to most of the empire, all of the empires.
Britain needed to dominate it. I mean, obviously back then, Gibraltar, as it still is, was British. Malta was still British then. Cyprus was British then, and of course Egypt was British then. So
It was like one of the key lifelines of the whole empire. So making an enemy of Italy was a terrible move. I don't know. I'm not actually clear right now at what point we became irreconcilable with Italy. I mean, was it actually the war itself that caused that?
No, it was before that, and it was over Abyssinia when Britain went totally against Italy.
It's probably when we invited them into the League of Nations, isn't it? That was probably the point where you couldn't really go back.
Inviting Abyssinia into the League of Nations.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we've barely mentioned the League of Nations factor. I mean, that was actually a major factor of the 20s and 30s, wasn't it? Like, people really thought that was like, it was going to be the salvation of the world, and for some people,
and it was set up by Woodrow Wilson, the American president, and the vile American president, I might add. And of course, the Americans never joined it after it was set up by him because Congress wouldn't allow them to.
So that's covered in that documentary that I not necessarily that comprehensively, but there's some interesting stuff in there about that documentary I said, which was, again, it was an ocean apart. If we're going to be finishing fairly soon, I'm sure we're going to do another.
We will definitely have to do another stream because I do want to take this up to 1942.
I just wanted to respond to one of the comments that was on the screen earlier. It was about how Churchill was always getting him. I can't remember the wording, but Churchill was always going broke or getting himself in debt and having to be bailed out. Martin Gilbert, who was obviously a very strong admirer of Winston Churchill, he wrote a book called Churchill and we'll say the Tribe. That's not the title. But I made a video about it, picking out some things from that. And Churchill all his life, it wasn't just in the 30s that he was in debt. Churchill, and moreover his father and maybe probably his mother as well, they were very profligate people. They were very rich, born very rich, had big assets that they could live off the income and stuff, and they spent more than they had. Like they were constantly overspending, just not thinking about money. And Randolph Churchill, his father, and then Winston Churchill, sort of just by being born into it, they were friends with the Rothschild family, Cassel family, and the de Hirsch family, Maurice de Hirsch, Edmund Cassel, and I think the main Lord Rothschild at the time. And Cassel in particular, Gilbert says Cassel managed Churchill's finances. Now, what does that mean to a man who's constantly overspending? That means bailing him out, basically, and asking him to do stuff for him, I suspect. And I think that was a factor as well.
Lord Randolph Churchill was the younger son of the Marlborough family. And his wife, Jenny Churchill, was an American millionaire's daughter. And Randolph Churchill died of syphilis.
Quite young as well, right?
Yeah, fairly young. And Jenny Churchill, after the death of her husband anyway, was little better than an upper-class whore. The number of blokes she slept with who had enough money was really a lot, even by modern standards. But Churchill adored her his whole life, and of course, because she was an American, it gave Churchill this ridiculous idea that Brits and Americans are the same people, which they're not. Never have been.
Yeah, we talked last time about that, didn't we? What a disastrous idea that was, and obviously we laughed at the idea of the special relationship. I laugh rather bitterly at that, but yeah, I think like Churchill from birth.
Let me just say one thing. Don't get me wrong. There are plenty of good Americans, but that's not the American government. You know?
No, I would love it to be true. I would love to be like the brothers of. Yeah, I mean it's a great country.
There are. I've got good American friends. Including good American military friends or ex-military friends. There are plenty of good Americans, but that ain't the U.S. government. You know, it's like, you know, saying that any of us on here would agree with the British government. You know, we basically wouldn't. You know, on most things.
Yeah, it's like if you start talking to someone from I don't know another country and they start going, "Oh yeah, you guys, you fucked us in the 50s." I'm like, no, right, that wasn't me. That wasn't my kind. That was
absolutely correct.
People in charge. Yeah, but I think like Gilbert himself, like an admirer of Churchill, he does show how Churchill had lived a life of luxury and not thinking seriously about money. I think that's reflected in Churchill's spell as Chancellor as well, and how he conducted the war and how he conducted like the late 30s, like in comparison to Chamberlain. Like Chamberlain was concerned with the survival of, like, to put it crudely, capitalism or, you know, like laissez-faire economics. Like Chamberlain did not want to ruin the country money-wise. He thought that was very important. 100%. Yeah, let's not get over-debted because that brings whole, you know, I mean, look at what caused the consequences of getting in debt to America in the tens. Like that was, you know, that's terrible. That makes them more powerful than us in certain ways. So I think that was reflected all through Churchill's life, including in relation to the focus, but also including how he conducted himself as a minister. And obviously, like what you mentioned earlier about how his wacky calls for, like, let's just build loads more biplanes. And so I said, let's not worry about the money. Money, because you had Keynesianism appearing at this point as well.
Yeah, you did.
And like Keynes is like, Keynes sometimes unfit, like people exaggerate how sort of wacky his theories were, but it was like
I don't think they do exaggerate. Actually, I think he was just wacky. But
he continued. No, I hate Keynes, but he continues to have a cadre of very strong backers like Robert Skidelsky and Paul Krugman and people like this. But there is also like the practice of sort of quasi Keynesianism after the war. Is actually worse than what Keynes recommended, but what Keynes recommended was terrible as well. An absolutely ridiculous theory, if anyone reads his general theory, but which is not a general theory, it's a lie, it's just a theory. But anyway,
I think we're in broad agreement on this, but we're definitely going to have to do a part 3 of this stream because what we've done so far is basically we've looked at the Washington Naval Treaty and how that weakened the Royal Navy fatally, really. We've looked at how Japan was turned into at least a potential enemy. And we've looked at how Italy was deliberately turned into an enemy. So, we're getting there.
So we bridged sort of the mid-20s to the mid-30s. And before we do another episode, I'll brush up a lot on because then the detail really matters from the sort of mid-30s onwards. There's so many sort of pitfalls detail-wise like that, one can easily get wrong.
Absolutely. But look, I know, Horus, your time limit is about 10 minutes or something, isn't it?
Yeah, I better go now. Yeah, but
all right. Well, let's. I'll just ask if there's any final thoughts. First of all, from Alan.
No, I'm good. We have covered quite a lot, so.
I mean, like, I'd like to do the next stream this time next week if you're available, Horus and Ataman. But if not, we can always make it in the next 2 weeks. It doesn't really matter. But look, there's so much to cover on this stream because we're not just looking at Britain and Winston Churchill. We're also looking at other nations because Britain's foreign policy is not operating in isolation. So. We kind of have to do that. So have either of you guys got any final thoughts? Or after that, do you have anything you would like to show, chaps?
No.
Sorry, Alan, go on.
No, carry on.
I trod on your... I spoke over your intro as well.
I've got nothing to show, so I'm all good on this end.
I haven't made any new content of my own, so I'm not going to shill my stuff. I mean, I'm on Odyssey if anyone wants to see the video that I mentioned of mine. But Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised how little we've disagreed so far. But the next five or 10 years that we cover, I mean, maybe we will, but we'll see. But I think it's really, really interesting, and I appreciate being on here. And I'll come back to you about next week. I think I'm free, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, if you could let me know, mate. And if you do have anything you want to show, like Odyssey channels or what have you, if you put them in the Discord, I'll stick them in the description later on. Although I'm going to bed first because I haven't been asleep tonight. But it's still only 6:43 a.m. here. In the chat, Richard Ford says Italian fascism stream when, Mr. Duke. I'm not against doing an Italian fascism stream at all. I tell you what, I'd love to get Paul Godfrey to come and do it. But yeah,
I'd love to do a stream like that. There is at least 3 more books I'd like to get through before we did anything like that.
Yeah, look, I'm not looking to do it immediately, but yeah, at some point we can certainly do that.
Ataman, do you want to name those books? Because I wouldn't mind. I need to read more about Italy.
Well, there's a book I picked up recently by James Gregor called Mussolini's Intellectuals. And there's a book, quite a recent release actually, by John Foote, just called Blood and Power, about the rise of Mussolini. And there was another one, I can't remember what it's called. I can't see it either.
Because I've asked around before for like just biographies of Mussolini, and there's not many of them. Like I can't find a sort of an obvious one. Likewise, Neville Chamberlain. I can't find one comprehensive biography of his life. There's one guy who wrote a first volume, and he appears to just have never done the second volume. It's like people just don't want to read about Chamberlain,
wasn't he, for a while, Chamberlain? I mean, even up to like 10 years ago, people just used to call him the appeaser.
Yeah, the appeaser, and why appeasers are wrong.
It's disgraceful. It's so unfair. It's just such an unfairly maligned figure. It's not right.
I mean, look, like I said, his huge error was giving that ridiculous guarantee to Poland. If he hadn't have done that, I would be entirely in favour of Neville Chamberlain.
Buchanan strongly agrees. Goes on at great length to argue that, and I agree.
Yeah, it was just a stupid move. You don't give another country your war button. You just don't. And apart from anything else, as soon as Chamberlain did that, and of course the French copied him and did the same thing, as soon as that happened, it made the Poles say, well, we're certainly not going to negotiate,
What did you say? You don't give another country your war. What was it?
Your war button.
Your war button. Yeah. So make that the title of next week's stream, maybe.
Yeah, maybe that's not such a bad idea. But I mean, it just reminds me a bit with all the crap that's going on with bloody Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's just so similar. Like, I don't care who runs Ukraine. Honestly, I don't care if the Russians run it or the Ukrainians run it. I don't care at all. It's not a vital British interest.
I agree. Seems a good
and yet we're going to have old age pensioners freezing to death this winter because they can't pay their fuel bills because of flipping Ukraine. Just crazy.
Just to touch on that, just very briefly, I saw a stat today, just to finish this off. Do you know that last year Germany spent the equivalent of less than 1% of their GDP on gas, and this year they're going to be spending 8.4%?
Yeah, and I mean you've seen Ataman the same as I have. That everyone's predicting 20% plus inflation in the UK by the end of next year.
Yeah,
it's just, and look, this isn't going to be a recession. This is going to be a depression we're going to go into, and everything is going to become much more difficult and much more expensive for average people than it has been for many, many years.
All right, my last question just before we finish. So have you guys seen this poster? There's a poster in the colours of the Ukrainian flag, and it says, I can't remember, it says like you're going to have to be cold for their good or something like that.
Yeah, because they need more or something like that. Yeah.
Is that a government poster or is that a joke or what? Like what?
I think it's been put up by a marketing agency, so it's probably one of these crappy think tanks somewhere.
But Johnson
can't be serious.
Johnson and the Conservatives have absolutely been saying that over the last few days.
Yeah, it says you'll be cold in the winter because they need it more. That's the.
Oh my God!
And the Ukrainians have lost more men in this war than the entire British army.
Well, I've heard it on good authority from actual British government figures that apparently this is the turning point, and now Ukraine will push them back this time.
Yeah, sure they will.
But
And-
anyway, I
and
think we should
then
end
the-
it on that anyway.
And then these people will wake up and realize they were just having a dream. But anyway, yeah, I'm going to play us out with a tune, dudes. And you guys, if you need to go, because I've got a little thing to show just at the end of the stream. But I'm going to play us out with a tune.
I'm on my way down to the quay with a ship on anchor lays. To command a gang of navvies there, they told me to engage. I thought I'd jump in for a while before I sail away, for to take a trip on an immigrant ship to the shores of Botany Bay. Farewell to your bricks and mortar, farewell to your dirty lime, farewell to your gangway and to your cranks, and to hell with your overtime. For the good ship Ragamuffin, she's lying at the quay, for to take old Pat with a shovel on his back to the shores of Botany Bay. Hey! The best years of our lives we spent working on the docks, building mighty wharves and piers from earth and ballast to rocks. Our pensions keep our jobs secure, but I won't through the day. We don't take a trip on an immigrant ship to the shores of Botany Bay. Farewell to your bricks and mortar, farewell to your dirty lime, farewell to your gangway and your gangplanks, and to hell with your overtime. For the good ship Ragamuffin, she's lying at the quay, for to take old Pat with a shovel on his back to the shores of Botany Bay. Gonna take it back to the Botany Bay shores. The boss came up this morning to say, well, Pat, you know, if you don't mix all that mortar quick, I'm afraid you'll have to go. Well, of course he did insult me, so I demanded all me pay. And I told him straight that I'm gonna emigrate to the shores of Botany Bay. Farewell to your bricks and mortar, farewell to your dirty lime, farewell to your gangway and your gangplanks, and to hell with your overtime. For the good ship Ragamuffin, she's lying at the quay, for to take old Pat with a shovel on his back to the shores of Botany Bay. To the shores of Botany Bay! And when I reach Australia, I'll go and search for gold. There's plenty there for digging up, or so I have been told. And when I pay me fortune, there'll be no more bricks to lay, and they'll take me ease doing what I please on the shores of Botany Bay. Farewell to your bricks and mortar, farewell to your dirty lime, farewell to your gangway and your gangplanks, and to hell with your overtime. For the good ship Ragamuffin, she's lying at the quay, for to take old Pat with a shovel on his back to the shores of Botany Bay, for to break his back with a shovel and a sack on the shores of Botany Bay.
Okay, gents, that was Chris Gard. Do go and check his channel out. It's a good one. Australian dude. Thank you to my guests, Horus, and also to Ataman. And I'd just like to say, don't forget to come back and see us at 9 p.m. UK time, which is 6 a.m. Australian time, and 2000 Greenwich Mean Time for our Splendid Isolation stream on Saturday evening UK time, which is Friday morning in Australia. Sunday morning in Australia. So come back and see us for those. I will be putting some other links in the description, but if you want to see part one of this stream, the link for that is already in the description. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like the channel and subscribe to sorry, to like the stream and subscribe to the channel.